45 years ago, on this date, I was in the jungles of Vietnam. That was the conflict of the day. I see some gray hair in the audience. You remember that we had a draft in those days, and I thought that would be the most wasted year of my life. But I found myself surrounded with a whole lot of young GIs who didn't have college deferments. Many of them dropped out of school, dropped out of high school. Drugs were very cheap and very pure over there, so a lot of those kids got strung out badly. And I was able to set up an amnesty drug abuse program. Some of those kids really needed to get straightened out before they came back to the States. Others wanted to finish their high school diploma, so we set up a GED course. The net effect is that year of my life that I thought would be wasted ended up being not only a productive year, but a turning point in my life. I had been in the business world before going into the military, but I had a sense of calling that I wanted to work with troubled young men. And so when I came back to the States out of the military, I didn't stay in my business career very long. That sense of calling stayed with me, and eventually I moved into the nonprofit world, set up a program with the juvenile court in Atlanta to work with kids on probation. That was a beginning of a whole new adventure for me. It did not take me very long to figure out that you can't work very effectively with troubled young adolescents apart from their home situations. And so I went back to school to learn how to work with families. We expanded our program to include the families of kids on probation, and eventually it became apparent to me that it's very difficult to work with struggling families apart from the environment that impacts on them every time they step out of the door. And so that pushed me to get more involved with what was happening with the police and on the streets and in the schools. Eventually, I concluded that if you're going to change an environment, clearly the most effective way to do it is to work from within for change, to become a part of that environment. That is an insight that one does not share quickly with one's spouse. Matter of fact, I waited way too long. We were in the process of building Peggy, my bride's new dream home, a little farther out of the city. And we were actually about 5 weeks away from moving in. And I remember the night that it happened. We'd gone to bed early. Peggy just wanted to talk. This is when you're picking out the carpet and the light fixtures and the cabinetry. This is high energy stuff. And she just wanted to talk. I said, I don't think you want to talk to me tonight. She said, oh, really? What's wrong? And I said, I don't think we're supposed to be moving farther out of the city. I think we're supposed to be moving into the city. Well, that was a bad night. In the morning, Peggy says, is this your idea or God's idea? Because if it's your idea, I don't want to have anything to do with it. She said, I want it in writing. And so that was the first time I articulated in a 7-page letter as best I could what I felt was a sense of mission. And she took that around to her girlfriends and our small group leader in our church and our pastors, and eventually concluded that at least I believed that it was a calling. And if it is, then what choice do you really have? It's a tribute to Peggy's spiritual depth, that she gave up her vision, her dream of a new home in a safe environment where we could raise our 2 boys with good friends in good schools, the kind of environment she had grown up in. And let go of that dream in exchange for moving into a high crime area that felt like a very strange and unsafe place to raise a family. Well, that was the beginning of another major turning point in my life, in our lives. That was about a 10-year learning curve. I'd been commuting back and forth into the inner city for 10 years, and finally we moved in and became part of the community. During that 10 years, I had started a lot of different programs. We got use of an old Presbyterian church that had closed, and I set up my office there. And we started doing the things that caring people do for those in need, the food pantry, the clothes closet. The one that created the most excitement was what we called our Adopt a Family for Christmas. That was when I would identify kids that were not going to get anything for Christmas and give those names to caring people from around the city who would go shopping, buy toys, and then on Christmas Eve would deliver those toys to the homes of these children. And it created a lot of excitement. But the first year that we were there in the city, that was really the first year that I had enough time on my hands to be in the homes of some of the recipient families when the gift-bearing families arrived. And I saw something that I had never seen before. The kids, of course, were all excited. Santa Claus is coming. The moms were gracious. They were a little reserved, maybe a little embarrassed. But if there was a dad in the home, he just disappeared. He was gone out the back door. And it dawned on me what was happening was that these parents in front of their own kids were being exposed for their inability to provide. And the moms would endure that indignity for the sake of the kids. But it was just more than fatherly pride could handle. It was as though his impotence was being exposed in front of his wife and kids in his own living room. It was killing him. I'd never seen that before. And it was deeply disturbing to me. And it made me wonder, is this same kind of indignity happening in the other programs that we have going on here? I was reading everything I could get my hands on in those days on poverty, and frankly, there wasn't a lot of literature, but I came across one author by the name of Jacques Ellul. He's a French philosopher, theologian. He was writing about the city and poverty. And there was, out of one of those books, this quote jumped off the page at me. I thought we had you're going to have to listen carefully. Ellul, there it is. Ellul says, almsgiving, that's the old word for charity. Almsgiving is mammon's perversion of giving. It affirms the superiority of the giver. It binds the recipient and demands gratitude. It humiliates him and reduces him to a lower state than he had before. Can you see why that hit me right in the gut? That wasn't why we were there, to diminish anybody, certainly not to humiliate anybody. And if Ellul is correct, we were doing just that. And I had to reflect on what my attitude was. I certainly enjoyed being in a giving position, certainly rather be in a giving position than a receiving position. And I think I covered my sense of pride with a facade of humility. But Ellul's words penetrated me. I started to see that the kind of giving we were doing, instead of empowering folks, lifting them up, it seemed to be doing just the opposite. I saw a progression or a regression, a cycle that kept repeating itself over and over again in the way we were doing charity. If I gave somebody something once, it always elicited appreciation, surprise, delight. Thank you so much. This is very, very kind of you. It was a good thing. But if I gave somebody something twice, it started to create just a little anticipation. Oh, I wonder if this is what he does. I wonder if this is a program that he's starting. A little bit of anticipation. By the third time, I created an expectation. I know this is what he does. I need to get in line, get in position to get the next gift that is coming. It's an expectation that I've created. By the fourth time, it's become an entitlement. You owe me. I'd rather have a ham this Thanksgiving than a turkey. Thank you. I've got a voice in this. This is a right. And by the fifth time, it just became dependency. You can't stop now. We're counting on this. We're depending on this. I saw that spiral, that downward cycle repeat itself over and over again, and I realized this is not healthy, what is going on here. There is toxicity in this system that we just we've got to get rid of. And so we made the decision, we're gonna cut out all of this one-way giving, and we're only going to give to those that are in a crisis situation. Whereupon the incidence of crises skyrocketed. Everybody had a crisis. I said, whoa, wait a minute. There's a difference here between what's a crisis and what's a function of chronic poverty. A crisis demands an emergency response. That's when an earthquake hits Haiti. That is a crisis. That demands a response. We get in there with life-saving medical supplies, clean water, food, shelter, emergency supplies to a crisis. It's absolutely the right thing to do. But as soon as the crisis has passed, then it's time to shift. Things become more chronic. Now it's time to shift into development. That is, helping folks rebuild their lives, rebuild their homes, get back on their feet, rebuild their businesses. Time to shift from a crisis intervention to now developing people. A crisis need, when you address it with a crisis intervention, that is an emergency response, it's absolutely the right thing to do. That saves lives. On the other hand, if you address a chronic need with an emergency response, a crisis intervention, people are harmed. Let me give you an example that I saw this past fall. You remember when Katrina hit New Orleans? That's been 10 years ago. We just saw some national coverage on that. Remember Katrina? Well, that was clearly a crisis, and as a nation, we responded with emergency responses, and they were the right responses, not very orderly, but it did save lives. Now, 10 years later, do you know what is still going on in New Orleans? Carrying people loaded down with convoys of emergency supplies flow into New Orleans to care for the victims of Katrina. You get that? Victims. Created a whole victim class of people in New Orleans who are dependent for their livelihood on the ongoing outpouring of compassionate people from around the country. And it's become a way of life. That's an emergency response to what is clearly a chronic poverty issue. And it's hurtful to people. What about hunger? What about hunger in our country? Is hunger a crisis need or a chronic need? Let me make it easier. Starvation. Is that crisis or chronic? Well, that's crisis, clearly. That's when a famine sweeps through sub-Saharan Africa. People are dying of starvation. You got to get in there with containers of medical supplies and food and clean water, etc. That demands an emergency response. But in this country, we really don't have starvation. I've been serving in inner city Atlanta for 44 years now, and I have yet to see the first starving person. I've seen folks miss meals. I've seen folks eat peanut butter sandwiches for the last 3-4 days of the month. I've seen homeless guys dumpster dive. I've seen bad nutrition. I've seen food insecurity, but starvation? No, not once. But look at the way we are addressing in our culture the issue of hunger. Our food pantries, our soup kitchens, our giveaway emergency responses to a need that is clearly chronic and not crisis. Remember the old adage, feed a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach him to fish, he eats for a lifetime. Well, those food pantries, our giveaway food programs, those should have been shifted. Those are fish feeding stations. That should have been shifted into fishing teaching classes years ago, so that we enable people to begin catching fish on their own. But for some reason in our culture, that hasn't connected to us. And so we create unhealthy dependencies among the poor. There is a reason why the poor remain poor in our country. I think it has to do with the way we're doing our charity. So what are we going to do? We said in our little community, if we're going to rid the toxicity from our charity, we've got to make some changes. One thing we said was we've got to narrow our focus. We can't serve the poor all over the south side of Atlanta. We're just spread way too thin. So we're going to narrow it down to our immediate communities where we have the opportunity to get to know folks and to get to know their situations and to build relationships so we know our neighbors. So we narrowed our focus. And then we said we have to change the way we view our neighbors. Instead of seeing them as people in need, we've got to start seeing them as people with resources, people with talents, people with abilities. That no one is so poor that they have nothing to contribute in our community. Nobody's that poor. Everybody has something to contribute. And it becomes the responsibility, I believe, of those of us who are stewards of resources to set up those systems of reciprocity where everybody can participate in giving in one way or another in the community. Now, sometimes there are certain people that it's a little more difficult to find out what their talents are, like the homebound seniors in our community, the Meals on Wheels folks. What do they have to contribute? Well, they're the ones that are always looking out through the Venetian blinds. They're watching everything that's going on the street. And they're on their phones talking to their elderly neighbors up and down the street. That's your crime watch. Those are very valuable people. If we identify them and acknowledge them and organize them, very valuable members of the community. What about those darn kids that spray graffiti all over everything and just mess up our community? Right down the middle of our neighborhood, 2 blocks long, there's a 8-foot high corrugated metal fence, dead ugly, graffiti all over it. It hides a junkyard that's behind it. And one of our staff guys lives in the community, was talking to a couple of taggers. They put their tags on stuff, spray cans. I was talking to a couple of them, and he said, can you guys paint something that's good looking, that's happy, that might make people feel good in this neighborhood? And they got to talking about that, and what developed was they said they could probably do that, and would be willing to work with other young people and adults to kind of help them do a mural along that 2 blocks. And so they picked a couple Saturdays. We said we'll provide the spray cans, and those kids led folks in the community spraying pretty pictures on that 8-foot-high corrugated metal fence. Took them about 3 Saturdays to do it. Our neighbor guy wanted his wife and family to get their picture taken behind one section of that fence. But that's what that fence now looks like. Those are taggers. One of those kids really had some artistic ability, and we said, could we commission you to do a mural on the side of our office building that would communicate welcome to our community? And so we hired him to do it, provide the spray cans. And so that's what you see when you come into our neighborhood now on the side of our building. Welcome to South Atlanta. Everybody has something of value to contribute if we look for it. And then we said we've got to start seeing folks as capable, and we've got to stop doing for folks what they can do, what they have the capacity to do for themselves. And so we adopted this golden rule. I'll never do for others what they have the capacity to do for themselves. When I do that, when I pick up somebody else's load that was not intended for me to carry, I disempower. I make people weaker. And so with those changes, we just launched into a whole revision of the way we go about charity. The second Christmas we were in the neighborhood, when folks started calling in to get their adopted family, we said, would you give an extra gift this year? Would you give the gift of dignity to the dads? And here's how you do it. Go shopping, buy the toys, don't wrap them. Bring them to the community, and we'll set up a little storefront. We'll call it the Old Toy Shop. And we'll put somewhere between a wholesale and a garage sale price on those toys. And we'll invite parents to come in and go shopping, so that on Christmas morning, the parents in our community have the same joy that most parents in our city have of seeing their children open the gifts that they have purchased through the efforts of their own hands. And there will be dignity in the process of exchange. And if somebody doesn't have the money, they're unemployed, well, we're creating cash flow here. That means we can employ unemployed parents so that folks can work and earn money so that they can buy for their kids as well. Now that's a kind of a stretch, allowing us to sell the toys that folks were used to giving away and having the joy of seeing kids receive it. That's a stretch. But when I explained, you know what a kid needs even more than a gift for Christmas, is an effective parent. And we're going to take the proceeds from the sale of these toys and start an employment training program for unemployed parents, so that this time next Christmas, some of those parents will be fully supporting of their own families. I asked them for an extra gift. I said, you know that wonderful warm feeling that you get when you see the kids so excited about the gifts you brought? That's what I want you to give to the dads, so that they have that rush of emotion on Christmas morning. Well, we learned a couple very important lessons that first Christmas. One, we learned that parents would a whole lot rather work to earn, to purchase the toys that they knew would delight their kids than they would stand in the free toy lines with their proof of poverty and accept gifts that somebody else had purchased for them. We found that out. We also found out a universal truth. Universal, that means applies to all people of every culture. It's this: everyone loves to find a bargain. Universal. So Peggy came home this past Christmas after a grueling day of Christmas shopping. She lugged in her bags and spread out her treasures all around the living room for me to admire. And she said, and you know what? She said, I saved more than I spent. Well, I'm not an economist. Somebody else has to explain that high finance to me. But I do know this. She was excited about finding bargains. So why do we think it would be such a blessing to the poor to deprive them of the joy of finding and purchasing bargains for their own kids? The clothes closet. Now, that clothes closet was always a bit of a challenge. We gathered in a lot of free clothes, and we said to our neighbors, these are the free gifts of God's people. These are freely given, and help yourself. And it seemed like a wonderful spirit until we actually opened the doors and folks came charging in and grabbing up as many armfuls of clothes as they could carry out. And then I'd find them scattered around the community, no place to try them on. And I realized this is not very good stewardship. And so we hastily drew up some rules and posted them. Limit the number of garments that you can get per visit. Limit the number of visits that you can get per month. Well, that was like saying, let the games begin. Can I get some garments for my kids that are in school? Well, that's reasonable. Can I get some garments for my sick uncle who can't get in here today? You just know where that's going. In no time, we're behaving like police, guarding the resources against the very folks that we were there to serve among. It turned into an adversarial relationship almost overnight. Not at all what we had in mind. We had in mind sharing our lives, sharing our resources, being a blessing to folks, not being greed guards to make sure folks didn't get too much. So I was explaining this dilemma to a Methodist men's group who had helped us collect clothing, and I said it's frustrating because it's not building good relationships. And they said, well, there's a simple answer to that. You know how those that aren't there have simple answers to things. They said, yeah, there's a simple answer to that. It's called the market. You put a fair rate of exchange on a desired commodity, it cuts all that out. I said, really? He said, oh, yeah. So I said, would you help me set that up? And they said, yeah. They had a meeting and said, yeah, we'll take that on as our men's project this year. And so those guys set about doing what they cannot help doing even in their sleep. Got to have a business plan, traffic flow patterns, real estate research, got to be on a bus line, shop the competition. We got to bring this in right underneath the Goodwill Industries thrift store. They said, if we do it right, we can train folks in retail merchandising, moving them out into the economic mainstream. They said it takes about 2 years for a small business like this to break even. And they were pretty accurate. About 18 months later, that little clothes closet turned thrift store. broke even and became a very bright spot in our neighborhood, has ever since. And those guys were right. That dynamic changed instantly. The dynamic between giver and recipient, where the giver has to guard against the recipient getting too much, and the relationship between merchant and customer, where the merchant needs the customer to buy all that they can afford to buy. He needs the customers because that's how he pays a light bill and meets payroll. Changed the dynamic totally. And the 4 trainees that we hired from the community, they picked up on that quickly because it was their paycheck that's riding on return customers. And so how do we keep folks coming back here? It was a challenge. Well, they said, at least we ought to get down everybody's name. And if we can find out something about them, let's write that down. So when Miss Jones comes into the store on Tuesday morning, you say, "Good morning, Miss Jones. How are you this morning? How's your mother doing?" See, everybody likes to go where everybody knows their name. And so we jumped in a van, went out the shopping mall to see how the real stores did it. And the debrief on that was really interesting. They said, well, everybody was very friendly, very nice, and they had the big for sale racks right there when you come in, and the clothes were all neatly hung, hangers all going the same way, were sized, some of them even color coordinated. And then they had the latest fashion arrivals, and one of the women said, yeah, you know, those stores smell nice too. You know, when you're dealing with used clothing, sometimes it can be a little stale. And so they started figuring out, how can we make the aroma in our store nicer? Well, you can't dry clean everything. You don't have money for that. But one of the women said, you know, we could have a pot of fresh brewed coffee going in the morning. That would help. And another said, yeah, we could do microwave cookies, and that would help. This is about communicating to your customers that you value them. And I want to tell you, the customers picked that up instantly. They were valued instead of guarded against. We learned an interesting thing in that process. One of God's magical gifts to humanity. It's called the economy. And it goes like this. It happens in every culture. This lady here has been growing tomatoes this year, and she's had a bumper crop, more than her family needs. And this guy over here has been raising corn, and he's got more than his family needs. And so they come together at the exchange table, call it the market, and work out an exchange of so many tomatoes for so many ears of corn. And if the deal is done well, they both go away, and here's the magic. They both go away feeling like they got more value than they brought. That's magic. That's why Peggy was so excited. She got more value than she brought in her mind. It happens in every culture. It's called, on a national level, called balance of trade. It's how wealth is created. It's how societies flourish. So why on earth do we think it would be a blessing to our poor to exclude them from the process of exchange, of exchanging value for value? Our food co-op, our food pantry, we had trouble getting that equitable. Somebody would donate a couple dozen canned hams. Well, you got 50 people standing in line. How do you distribute that equitably? Somebody gets canned corn and somebody else gets pickled beets. Just underneath the surface, there's some dissatisfaction. But like Elul says, that system demands gratitude. Everybody has to smile and say thank you. But it certainly did not lead to honest and genuine relationships. You never knew what was concealed behind a smile. And so one of our volunteers said, have you all ever heard of doing a food co-op? He asked the folks standing in our food pantry line one day. They said, what is that? And he said, well, you put in $3, and we combine that with our food pantry money, and we go over to the Atlanta Community Food Bank as a nonprofit. We can get food there for just a processing fee. And there were about a dozen women that said, yeah, we'd like to try that. And so they put their $3 in. He made the run to the food bank, came back with a lot of food. And they were amazed. And the word got out, this is a good deal. And now folks were wanting to join that co-op. We had more than 50 folks signing up. Well, the first issue that surfaced was our volunteer wasn't bringing home the right assortment of food. Some grumbling about that. So we said, well, why don't you elect a buyer, somebody takes your grocery list for you? And so they did. That was the first organizational step of that little co-op buying club. Next thing that came up was credit. What if somebody doesn't have their $3 this month? Do we extend them credit? Well, that wasn't our decision to make. That was the decision of those that had skin in the game, that it was their $3 that was being put at risk. So I said, it's your choice. And so they had a big discussion about who is creditworthy and what if somebody didn't pay back, do you kick him out? And midway into that discussion, one of the women said, we're making some decisions here. We need to write this down. And so they looked around and elected a secretary. And then they said, somebody's got to keep track of who's paying back and who isn't. We need a treasurer. You see what's happening is that the talents, the abilities have been there all along. But when folks were standing in our free food lines, we never knew what those talents were. And those co-ops have grown up. We've got 6 of them now with 50 households in each one. And it has virtually eliminated the need for a giveaway food pantry. We never closed the food pantry down. It just started collecting dust because folks were leveraging their small resources to eliminate food insecurity in their lives. Everybody has something of value to bring. It becomes the responsibility of the stewards of resources to set up those systems of exchange. I thought to myself, the medical profession has a code of ethics that they follow. Remember Hippocrates back before the time of Christ? We've called him the father of modern medicine. He wrestled with that issue that physicians were making life and death decisions every day, and they really didn't have an ethical code to guide their decisions. And so he developed it, and it's now called the Hippocratic Oath, and physicians to this day take the Hippocratic Oath. I thought, wouldn't it be good if we had some kind of an oath for those of us that are in the nonprofit world, those of us that are serving the poor, could subscribe to? And so I've given it a shot. This is number 1. I will never do for others what they can do for themselves. When we do for others what they have the capacity to do, we diminish them. Number 2, I'll limit my one-way giving to crises and seek always to find ways for legitimate exchange. Number 3, I'll empower folks by hiring, lending, and investing. Hiring, that is an honorable transaction. Michael, a homeless guy in my neighborhood, doesn't ask me for money anymore. He asks me if he can wash our ministry van. And very often it needs a wash job. And Michael does a very good job. And I am happy to pay him $25 for that job. There are some on our staff that say, you're just enabling him. He's going to take that money out and he's going to get high on it. You're enabling a destructive lifestyle. And I say, no. I have entered into an honorable exchange with Michael. He's done a good job. He deserves fair compensation for that job done. And when Michael leaves, his dignity is intact. He leaves a free man. He is free to make whatever choices, for good or not, that he will choose to make with the money he has earned. It is an honorable transaction. Now, if I gave Michael $25, then I'd feel a sense of responsibility to make sure that he spent it in the right way. That's conditional loving. Hiring is an honorable transaction. Lending, well, lending brings accountability to the whole exchange process. When Diane comes to my front door and asks me for $20 until Saturday, I give it to her every time. I don't even ask anymore what she needs it for, because I know that on Saturday, Diane will come back and she'll pay me back my $20. When Ethel comes to my door and says, will you give me $20? I say, not until you pay back the last $20 that you borrowed from me. There's accountability in lending. Investing, well, that's when a young painter in our neighborhood who's pretty good at house painting wants to start his own painting business, but he doesn't have capital to do that, to buy the ladders and a sprayer and that sort of thing. But if I invest in his business, I become an owner in that business. And my interest is in seeing that business thrive, not only because I believe in him, but because I've got my own money in that business. There's a level of accountability, and actually far more than that. It's helping him find more painting jobs, using my contacts, using my know-how to feed that into his business to ensure its success. Investing, kind of the highest level of charity. But gifts, very sparingly. The best are to reinforce achievements. 4, I'll put the interests of the poor above my own self-interest or that of my organization, even when it means setting aside my own agenda. One of our staff women went to an educational conference, international education in Africa. They were sitting around a table at one of the breaks, and the subject of mission trips came up. And one of the black educators from Africa that was in her group said, you know, there's something about you Americans that I've never understood. She said, what is it about you that loves to paint so much? She said, in our village, when the Americans were coming, they would let us out of school early and tell us to go out and get mud and dirt and mess up the outside of the building so that the Americans would have something to paint. She said that whole school building was painted 4 different times the 3 years I was a student there. She said, what is it about you that loves to paint so much? Well, you have to ask the question, whose agenda is this here? Is this our agenda to feel good, or is this something that is truly needed that will enable folks to take measured steps out of poverty? 5, I'll listen carefully to the spoken and unspoken needs of the poor, knowing that many clues may be hidden. We had a group recently come back from Haiti, And they were talking about walking through this little village and seeing mothers sitting outside their shacks with their babies wrapped in newspaper and soiled rags. And it touched them deeply. And they went into the city and bought up a bunch of baby blankets and passed it out to those mothers so that they would have something clean and warm and soft to wrap their babies in. The following day, when they came through the village, they noticed that in the shops along the street there were those blankets. Those women had sold those blankets. And our volunteers were incensed until a staff person on the ground said they sold them for food. Their real need is to feed their babies more so than blankets. Well, how do you know that? How do you know that? Unless you hang around long enough to build relationships, to get behind and beyond the politeness into the development of relationships where you can communicate honestly and candidly with each other. It's time and it's relational. And then 6, this is the same as the final tenet of the Hippocratic Oath. Above all, to the best of my ability, I will do no harm. Amen? Thank you.